Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to the City of Menlo Park 2021 Budget Workshop. I am Starla Jerome Robinson, Menlo Park City Manager, and I appreciate you taking the time to participate tonight. This year's budget theme is reimagine, rebuild, and reinvigorate the community. We have all experienced a difficult year filled with health concerns related to the pandemic, economic collapse, as well as isolation and an overriding sense of loss. Because of that, understanding the budget is more critical than ever. The general fund is the largest city fund and pays for most city services. City Council has the most discretion and control over the general fund, and therefore that will be a focus of our presentation tonight. The basic general fund budget that Assistant City Manager Nick Figueros and Assistant Administrative Services Director Dan Jacobson will present tonight is balanced with almost 58 million in revenue, offset with a corresponding 58 million plus or minus in proposed expenditures. In order to offer the City Council the most budget latitude, the basic budget contains the same services as the 2021 budget. In addition, the Council received a series of proposed services which can be added to the budget based on the Council's priorities and available funding from several sources, including the American Recovery Plan Act, as well as available fund balance. Before I turn it over to Assistant City Manager Nick Figueros, well, really City Clerk Judy Herron, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation for the hard work by all of the staff that prepared the budget. Budget preparation is a team sport that requires diligence by all. I think this year's budget demonstrates an active commitment to change and resiliency in a time of great uncertainty. And with that, I'm turning it over to you, Judy.
Thank you, Starla. And again, just echoing this welcome to Menlo Park's budget workshop. For members of the public who wish to ask a question, you can either use that hand feature in the bottom of your screen. If you're calling in from a landline or a cell phone, you can press *9. And we also have the chat feature available if you would like to type in any question or comment that you have. We will try to field questions as they do come in. So if you do have a question or comment, go ahead and engage that hand feature, press *9, or type it right into that chat feature. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Judy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Figueros. I'm the Assistant City Manager, and I'm pleased to present this evening, both with the City Manager, Starla Jerome Robinson, and Assistant Administrative Services Director, Dan Jacobson, our 2021-22 budget. This is, I believe this is my 6th budget with the City of Menlo Park, and I know it's quite a bit more for the City Manager, and I believe it stands 4th budget with the city. So we're very excited to be here tonight. Just a quick review of the agenda. We're going through the introduction now. I will walk through some budget basics, and then Dan will provide an overview of what's new in the budget, and then we'll wrap up with an overview from Starla, and we can take hand questions at that time. If you have a question while we're going through the presentation, please do feel free to put those in the chat box, and we will answer them as best we can. So let's go ahead and get started with budget basics. So the City of Menlo Park's budget is not quite the same as what we commonly understand government budgets to be, either at the state or the federal level. At the state or federal level, the budget is prepared by an elected chief executive, either the governor or the president, and they transmit their budget to a co-equal body, either a legislature or Congress. And included in their proposal, as I believe our current president has transmitted for the federal budget, are a number of policy and agenda priorities that reflect the elected chief executive's position and the reason for their successful election. That budget then goes to the legislature or Congress, which has equal authority over setting the budget. Typically, the two parties will negotiate almost entirely in private, which is very different from from Menlo Park and from cities in California. And where they two converge is where they have their spending plan. And then ultimately, at the end of the process, the chief executive has the authority to either approve or veto the budget. And if there is a veto, there is a remedy by the legislature to override that veto. So in Menlo Park, the budget really starts with city staff preparing a budget that's consistent with state laws, generally accepted accounting principles. The budget, the city must have a budget on July 1 or a spending plan effective July 1 in order to remit payments to vendors and employees. If you may have heard of Washington shut down, and that's because they did not have the budget appropriations to make their payments for non-essential services. The City of Menlo Park has 64 funds, and each fund is an independent accounting entity governed by rules and regulations established by either law, revenue source, so for example, grants, or city council policy. And as city manager Jerome Robinson mentioned, the general fund is the largest and most active of the city's funds, and it is the fund with the most discretion. So there are no outside restrictions other than what the city council decides to spend the funds on. Examples of one of the special revenue funds new this year, and Dan will go into this a little bit, is the Belhaven Child Development Center. Some of you may be familiar with the program. It receives several grants, and those grants each have different reporting requirements and auditing requirements, and so that program has 3 funds that provide early childhood education to ages 3 through 5. Another example of a fund is the Air Water Services. Water services are funded by the ratepayers, and all expenditures must be offset by the revenue from ratepayers, such that there is no support by the general taxpayer. In other words, if you're not a Menlo Park Municipal Water District customer, you're most likely a Cal Water customer or another water district customer. And your general taxes do not go to support the customers of Menlo Park Municipal Water District. Departments recommend the budget to the city manager. To the city manager, and their primary focus is to preserve the services, the existing services. So the direction to the budget to the department heads is we need to do everything that we did this year, and we need to modify that based on either legal obligations, so new state mandates, new reporting requirements, new services that were approved by the City Council during the year, or we need to include in the budget anything that is in relation to a City Council priority, that we have a scope and understand how the funding will work for that particular City Council priority. The city manager's recommended budget is then forwarded to city council members and community members. This year, we released the city manager's recommended budget on May 7th. Sorry, they believe it's May 7th. On May 7th, for everyone to begin the process of reviewing the rather large and comprehensive document. Then when we go to the next step of the process, this is really where the budget, this is where everything happens in regard to the budget. So we have community members communicating with individual council members, and then we get to the budget hearings, which this year are on June 8th and June 22nd. The community members and city council members have their make their comments and suggestions, and the city council deliberates. And ultimately, the majority of the city council adopts the 2021-22 budget. So moving on, by way of just a visual example, approximately 90 to 95% of what is in the city manager's recommended budget preserves the services that were provided this fiscal year. So what happened this fiscal year? This fiscal year was modified considerably by the pandemic. We experienced as part of the budget process for this current year, we reduced our staff or our headcount by 15%. Many of you may be aware that our congregate facilities or activities, so those facilities where people get together, like the library, the community centers, the senior centers have been closed and are scheduled to reopen here in the next fiscal year. And many of the activities were such as events and recreation programs were limited due to social distancing requirements. Through all that, our city staff has continued to provide some very important core services or essential services as identified by the city council and through our municipal code. For example, our public safety and community development services in slightly different or slightly modified ways to protect the safety of the public and the city staff, as well as childcare, which the city council had identified as an early service resumption based on findings in July of 2020. So as I mentioned earlier, the city council goes through a priority setting process, and this year the council adopted the priorities listed there. I'm not going to read through them. All of these priorities are funded or have the funding needed to get the work done in next fiscal year that's required or that's in queue. And so this is one of what staff considers one of the highest priorities for new spending. It's directly what the city council has shared with us, and if you have participated in the goal setting process, you know that it was a very robust conversation with plenty of opportunities for folks to offer ideas and suggestions to council, and we have these priorities as identified up here. What's not included of city council priorities, what's not included in the budget are two programs that really require city council to provide, to engage both the community and the city staff and deliberate amongst themselves. What does the future of downtown services, downtown infrastructure look like? And so we didn't really have enough information to identify a funding request for downtown and in addition to that, public safety. So these are city council adopted priorities that I anticipate will kick off the new year rather quickly, looking at various options on how we can work through improving or reimagining both of these services. So with regard to the city council's deliberations this budget cycle, there are three main buckets or three main questions that the city council will be asked to make a decision on. The first is, and they're listed there, but the first is the baseline budget. And the baseline budget, again, is everything that was provided, has been provided over the last fiscal year. So if we look at services like the gymnasium or gymnastics program, those services were not provided this year. And we have some capacity to restart the gymnasium programs, but we do not have capacity. The budget does not have funding to reestablish the gymnastics program. And so The baseline budget is everything that we experienced effectively this year. It includes a surplus of $9,000. And it also includes a transfer to general capital, which is the fund that we use to make capital investments in the community of $3.1 million. That is a city council past practice or past policy, and we have continued it. When we really look at to the core message of the budget, what we're going to do in the next year, one of the items that we provided, or one of the features of this budget that we haven't had necessarily in the past, is a robust grouping of our service level enhancements, which are things that are above and beyond what we're spent this year. The first tier one, and these are not in order; they're just grouped in buckets and tiers. So, tier one are council identified projects or programs that we have either received question or direct direction from one or two council members during public meetings for investment or consideration, and we have prepared proposals, and Dan will go through those in the next section. Tier two are staff identified expanded services. So these are restoration or reimagining of services that were lost during the budget cuts and represent a need that staff has identified in order to provide services to the community. Tier three are really investments in technology and customer service improvements. And if we learned anything from the pandemic, our reliance on technology and the ability to pivot quickly, and the importance of maintaining a high level of customer service takes time and investment. And so tier three represents those. And then finally, tier four are non-personnel city council or public inquiries or requests, the most notable being a proposal to pay down the unfunded pension liability, and Dan will mention that. The next question the council will be asked is timing, and this is really the how and the when. And there are two fundamental choices here, and I guess there's for each one it's sort of you can have a hybrid system. The first is, do we do these things? Do we make these changes, service level enhancements now? And if we do that, the city council has a contingency budget of $4 million in one-time revenue, which includes federal stimulus or ARP or American Recovery Plan Act money. That is there, and city council has the option of tapping that in order to approve any of the service level enhancements tiers 1 through 4. Additionally, Menlo Park currently has a temporarily reduced utility users tax, and that can that temporary reduction can be allowed to expire either in whole or in part, and that could generate additional revenue. And then finally, the city is very fortunate through hard work of both city councils and staff in the past of spending wisely and prudently, and we have accumulated a reserve balance of 32 million. So there are funds that can be used to fund this now, should the council decide to do that. Of course, there are offsetting considerations. Can we support these programs long term? How much is that long-term commitment? So I know, and I fully expect the council will ask those questions, and we'll be ready to answer those. And then finally, with regard to timing and with regard to when, as opposed to doing it now, there is the option of deferring some of these or all of these service level enhancements should the council decide to gain it, to really rely on fiscal recovery of the city's finances, most notably transient occupancy tax, which took a significant hit as a result of the pandemic. So with that, I will hand it off to Dan. Unless Dan, are there any urgent questions I should answer? I can't see them.
So there is one question, but I will address it in my first slide.
Excellent. So I will hand it off to you, Dan.
Okay, so as Assistant City Manager Pegueros mentioned, there are quite a few new things that we're encountering with this budget. Last year was also very new. This year has its own crop of new things. So I'll cover what some of those major changes are. So as discussed, City Council priorities are really the major change that is baked into what is in the proposed budget that is before the community and before the council at this point. So those things are a change from the baseline, and we do want to just highlight that those changes were already identified by City Council. They were already approved and have been incorporated. So that is a change from fiscal year 2020-21, which is sort of the benchmark that is worked from for the proposed budget. And then another major thing is around budgeting and accounting. So this includes a number of smaller categories within it. And part of this is due to just the greater ability afforded the city as we move to new technologies, one of which is changing the accounting system that the city uses. And some of them are just really best practices, and then some of them are the needs and changes identified by the city council and the community over the course of the year. So one of the first change in there is the creation of a one-time revenue fund. So this fund falls under the general fund, given that the money incorporated in it is unrestricted. So it does include American Rescue Plan Act funds. Those we anticipate that those will be received over 2 fiscal years. So this current fiscal year 2020-21 and the next fiscal year 2021-22. It is $6.5 million. So if you're looking at the budget and you say, why is there $3 million in one year and $3 million in the second year? That's just based on the disbursement schedule that we expect on that. All of those funds, though, are available for City Council's use between now and the end of 2024, the calendar year, not tied to the city's fiscal year. So that is one major change. In addition, other one-time revenues such as development agreements that are unrestricted in use are included in that one-time revenue fund. So that is a major change from the baseline. If you look back at prior years, there were development agreements which were included in the general fund, which have now been moved over to the one-time revenue fund. The next major funding change, and one that was finalized just very recently at the last City Council meeting, is that of the Bayfront Mitigation Fund. I will point out at this point that if you search for Bayfront Mitigation Fund, you won't find it in the funds list. It was called the City Services Contribution in the proposed budget, but will be updated before it goes back to council for adoption. So that is a change that will be made, but this is the fund that was created for the remaining funds from a development agreement for public safety, as well as a number of the funds that were received in the current fiscal year, and it will receive all of the funds for next fiscal year. So there will be a substantial fund balance in that one. I will also point out that there are no expenditures budgeted in that fund currently, just given there is still that unfunded discussion from City Council about how to reimagine public safety, and given that these funds are restricted to public safety uses, that will probably be a major point of what that discussion looks like. So there are revenues budgeted for that fund, but currently there are no expenditures in the proposed budget. And then rounding out this sort of new funds discussion, there are a number of other special revenue funds. So Mr. Pegueros mentioned some of the grants associated with the Bellhaven Child Development Center. There are also a number of funds for shuttle service and county programs. So those are new funds that if you look back in the financial statements for the city in the past, you won't see, but they are relatively minor changes just to make sure that all of the funds are separated so that their allowable expenditures can be used correctly. Now moving on to some of the more structural changes, I guess I could say. Pension costs are one that there are two components to this. So the pension costs include a number of components, both the ongoing cost as well as an unfunded liability which exists from the past. And there's also, in addition to that, this year, the employee cost share is broken out. So those are all shown as different line items in the budget currently. They are not in the past. So there is a little bit of it's not exactly comparable year to year, but we did want to include those as a way to just show the various components of what the pension costs are for the city employing its staff. And then the second component of pension costs, as Mr. Pegueros mentioned, is the unfunded liability. There is there is an ability to pay that down at an accelerated rate. The city does have a strategic pension reserve. We anticipate it to be approximately $3.9 million at the beginning of fiscal year 2021-22. That is not included in the baseline budget as proposed currently, but is an option for City Council's consideration. And then the major change here is really that over the course of 2 fiscal years, 2019-20 and 2020-21, the city has made accelerated payments to pay down those unfunded liabilities. So those are taken out just based on the City Council's direction to consider lower discount rates, which is a slightly different approach than has been made in the past. And so those are available for consideration in this coming year. And then rounding this out on the staffing side, at the beginning of fiscal year 2020-21, it was expected that the vacancy rate would be substantially lower than prior years. In large part, this was due to eliminating almost all vacancies citywide and just the anticipation that people would be less likely to be looking for a job during a pandemic. However, as the city looks forward to leaving the pandemic, there is the expectation that there will be a little bit more movement and that there will be a need for a vacancy factor. And so all this does is account for the fact that even though the city is authorized some number of positions, 248 3/4 as in the proposed budget, not all of those will be filled all of the time. And so the vacancy factor helps to balance the budget in a way that doesn't over budget for personnel costs. And then the last major change is service level enhancements a la carte. So this is not typically how service level enhancements have been handled in the past. In the past, typically the service level enhancements would be proposed by the city manager and considered by the city council. However, the City Council did express a desire to consider the budget in a more holistic manner. And so the question that we got is, why is gymnastics not included? It's an incredibly popular and successful program. And this is the reason for that, is gymnastics reopening is a major undertaking, will require additional work and scoping before it can actually be realized. And the City Council has expressed that desire to consider that in juxtaposition to all of the other opportunities for what the city staff can pursue and what services should be offered to the community. So this a la carte method is a way to sort of separate those things which have been previously identified, the City Council priorities, and the things which must be considered with the available resources to the city. So this is a very major change in this in this upcoming fiscal year, but will offer the City Council the opportunity to see all of the options that are out there rather than having any baked into the budget as proposed. So just a couple of general fund budget highlights here, and I will actually get into a couple of these in a little bit greater detail in the next section. One major one, and this is a very much a recurring theme in Menlo Park, at least during my tenure, is that property taxes are strong. And property taxes do make up a substantial portion of the available revenues in the general fund. And so having strong property taxes really does afford the ability to come from a strong fiscal position when considering what services are available to the community. The next item on there is the expected rebound in transient occupancy tax. You might hear us refer to this as TOT or hotel tax from time to time. This one was, as mentioned before, substantially affected by the pandemic. Shutting down things meant that people were not staying in hotels at anywhere near the historic highs that had been seen in previous years. We anticipate that travel will resume. My personal anecdotal experience is that there's a fair amount of pent-up demand for people to go out to restaurants, bars, go travel, and do the things that they haven't been able to do for the last year. So the city expects that there will be a very strong and quick rebound in transient occupancy tax. However, the amount that's in the proposed budget reflects the fact that there is still a bit of an unknown there, and the fact that people have been able to work remotely for so long may mean that there is a somewhat depressed rate of business travel, as meetings could happen virtually. And so the amount that is in the proposed budget currently is a very substantial increase from the prior year, but not quite as high as some of the previous fiscal years. The next thing to note is that American Rescue Plan Act funds are available under the revenue backfill use. So there are a large number of uses for the American Rescue Plan Act money, largely unrestricted. There are a handful of restrictions on there, such as that they cannot be used for unfunded pension liabilities. But generally speaking, they are largely available for use by the city, and one of those uses is as a revenue backfill. So as it turns out, using the methods as outlined by the U.S. Department of Treasury, up to the full balance of $6.5 million could be used by the city in a given fiscal year. That's not staff's recommendation. The recommendation before City Council is to use approximately 2/3 of those funds in the first year. That's where that $4 million comes from, as the placeholder. But the funds are available for use. So all of the activities in the general fund, again, with the exception of a few minor things, can be used by the American Rescue Plan Act funds. And there are other uses above and beyond that, but do want to point that out as a resource for the general fund. The next item on there, and moving from the revenue side to the expenditure side, is that personnel costs are largely flat. This is, again, in recognition of the fact that this budget as proposed does not incorporate a number of the available service level enhancements for consideration by the City Council. So there are a handful of minor changes, and again, changes such as the way the pension costs are displayed will slightly move some of the costs between those, but the proposed budget currently has largely flat personnel costs. And then this last point on here, I think is a really important one and really goes to the theme of the budget, is that there are no recommended reductions in service levels from the current level. So the City Council spent a lot of time during the current fiscal year, 2020-21, or prior to the current fiscal year, deliberating about what services were necessary to offer the community with the limited resources that were available to them. They made some extraordinarily hard decisions, but they turned out to be very fiscally prudent in that there are no recommended additional cuts at this point. So I think that that is absolutely, in my mind at least, a highlight of the budget as proposed. And then one category of the budget. So for those of you who went through the budget development process in running up to fiscal year 2020-21, that one was handled slightly differently than every other fiscal year, in that the capital improvement plan was not presented at the same time as the operating budget, which is mostly general fund, but a handful of other funds. This fiscal year, the CIP is being shown again with the operating budget for consideration. This is for those capital investment projects, many of which take several years to do. And so as projects are completed, they're removed from the plan, and as new ones are added, they get added in fiscal years. And so this is a slightly different approach, given that it is a 5-year plan rather than a single-year operating plan that the general fund and several other funds operate under. But did want to give a little bit of an overview, given that the CIP is presented with the budget this year. So there are a number of projects which are carried over from last year, 57. 35 projects are proposed to receive new funding in fiscal year 21-22. Just to note here, these funds are largely those special revenue funds and the general capital fund. So these are not general fund dollars, and in almost all cases are not interchangeable with general fund. The only difference is that transfer from the general fund to the general capital fund, but that really is intended as a way to keep up maintenance on many projects or many capital projects which have a multi-year lifespan. The CIP has 7 categories. These are all broken down within the budget. They are buildings and systems, environment, parks and recreation, stormwater, streets and sidewalks, traffic and transportation, and water system. And so they're all reasonably self-explanatory, I think, but each of the sections in the CIP also does have an overview of what those types of projects are and what individual projects are included in those. And then there are a number of programmatic categories. So these are ongoing needs. So again, that mentioned that there are a number of facilities that do require ongoing maintenance. So things like parks minor, if you find that project in the budget. This is something that you will see in generally every capital improvement plan budget as a way to keep up parks and sort of save up money for those and invest in projects as they are identified and need spending. There are a few notable changes to the capital improvement plan this year. One, and I think that this is one that the community has expressed great interest in, and so has the City Council, is prioritization criterion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a component of the climate action plan, and one that was added to really ensure that the projects which could meet that goal did so. And so those are more highly prioritized than they might have been absent the climate action plan. And then another one is there has been a desire by the community to have an increased transparency around which projects are development related. So the capital improvement plan does highlight a number of projects which are related to development. And so that is a change which was incorporated this year, again, to increase the transparency and just make it available for the public to understand, where some of these project needs were and how they were related to the community at large. And there are, as mentioned, there are a number of new projects, so I will not read through all of these, but they sort of fall in several different categories. Again, the aforementioned and something that we'll come back to on a regular basis, which is the City Council priorities and work plan projects. So there are a number of these which City Council has already expressed the desire to move forward. Those, in some cases, have new projects associated with them. Some projects are related to development projects, so they, in some cases, are a requirement. So the Bayfront Expressway pedestrian and bicycle bridge, for instance, again, going back to that transparency of which projects are development related. If you go to the category that includes that, you will find that it mentions the development project that it is associated with. So there are a number of these projects just given the terms and development agreements, and those are where some of those projects are originating. Moving on to the next section, so previously planned projects. Again, this is a 5-year plan. So the capital improvement plan is something that is updated on an annual basis, but really does look several years into the future in a recognition of the fact that many of these projects will take a number of years to complete, and they are investment in projects that will be around for many, many years, decades in a lot of cases. So some of the projects listed here were already planned prior to this upcoming fiscal year, but there is now, where they were in the pipeline has now reached the first year of the capital improvement plan. And then the last one there is just urgent maintenance. So there are some things which may not have been planned, but as new information is available, they do get added to the capital improvement plan. Okay, now let's see if I can take over screen sharing here, and I would like to walk through some of the transparency portal that is available to the public. So at this point, are you available, or are you able to see my screen? Okay, I think I see nodding. I'm down to one screen for the next day or so, I'll try to juggle here.
Yes.
Okay, so if you were to click on the OpenGov transparency portal, and it is available, we'll provide the link later, but it was also available in the staff report that said that the proposed budget is available. This is the splash page that you would land on. It would show the City of Menlo Park. It would show on this left pane a couple buttons here. It would show this graph exactly as it is. And then this is really your portal to the budget and to all budget related things. So I'm going to go over a handful of things that are available here, starting with this left pane. So this is the report page. So, notice the green highlighted on report. These are all of the reports that you can look at. The first 6 in the list are those which directly relate to the 2021-22 proposed budget. So they move down through revenues, expenditures, revenues alone, expenditures, the CIP, and then some other non-dollar related things with the exception of the service level enhancements. There's also a section at the end of this, but I'll get to that next. The other button in here is for stories. And so while all of the reports are really the visualization of what is typically the dollars in the spending plan, the stories are the narrative which accompany that. So if you want some additional context on what is in there, the stories are really the place to go. And if you want to see what those dollars are, if you want to drill down into the categories, the stories are where to go. So if you were to click on this first one here, it would open a new tab. I already have it open just to make sure that I'm not loading pages in front of anyone, but it will take you to the really the splash page of the narrative section of the budget. So this is the budget as proposed for fiscal year 21-22. It has all of the major players from both the elected side and the city staff side. And if you scroll down, there are a couple major sections which will lead you into some other more targeted sections of the budget. So this first section here with the introduction, budget discussion, and departmental summaries is really focused on the operating budget, and the capital plan is what's below that. And so one thing that I will highlight here, and I have sent several people this direction so far and will continue to send people, is the city manager's transmittal letter. So again, if you were to click that link, it would open a new tab. I have it open. But if you wanted to understand the budget, which is a several hundred page document, and you didn't have time or weren't sure where to start or weren't sure what you were interested in, this is the place to start. So this is where the city manager expresses to the community and the council what is included in the budget, what the goal of the budget is, and in many cases goes into much greater detail of those things. So we went through some of the major changes to the budget in the 2 minutes that it takes to cover on a slide. This will tell you in much greater detail what those major changes are. And then that is broken down between things like council priorities and the budgeting and accounting. So if you wanted to go back to that, you thought that seemed like something that was interesting, though I kind of doubted on the accounting side, no offense to accountants. This is where you would go back and be able to find more information on this. And then the section that I think is probably most salient to many people as they consider what is proposed in the budget is, sorry, skipping ahead a little bit. So budget reduction, so we covered what some of those were. These are expressed in greater detail. So these are all of the changes that happened with the current fiscal year, that is 2020-21. Going into that budget cycle and which are carried forward. There are a handful of minor changes. They are noted in those sections. So if you were to read under the community development section, you would read about the change that happened mid-year, and that's true for all of the departments there. And then the thing that I think many people are interested in is service level enhancement. So we talk about what's available. This is where there is a great amount of detail, both in terms of what that entails and the cost associated with it. So this is all outlined in the city manager's transmittal letter. There's a number of pages that talk about it. So definitely feel free to come back to it. But it really is the best place to go to get an overview of the budget at large. Now, if you were to scroll down much further in the page, you would find a number of these embedded graphs. And so these are all dynamic. So this is the general, or this is all funds revenues as displayed currently, but it will allow you a number of different options. So for instance, if you wanted to see what taxes entailed, you could simply click on taxes, and then it would tell you what's included in taxes. Again, I mentioned property taxes were strong. As indicated, property taxes are a very substantial portion of the budget. Now, this is all funds rather than general funds, so there are a little bit of differences between the two of them, but this is a great place to be able to drill down into some of those. And then there are a number of ways to change the visualization, and then also, so you could view it as a bar graph rather than a pie graph. It would show you over time. And then if you've gotten down to a lower level and don't like where you are or want to go back to where you were, you can click the back button or the reset, and it will reset it back to its original default state. So now that we've seen this embedded graph, I want to go back to where we have all the reports. So this is every graph that is embedded in the budget document is also available on the reports page. So I do just want to spend a little bit of time going over what's available there. This is the default view. It is revenues and expenditures. This particular one is focused on the general fund currently, but you can do the same sort of drilling down. And so in this visualization area, you could drill down into taxes. Again, let me see if I can move my window here. So there are options on the right side to change how things are displayed. I typically like the bar graph, but depending on your preferences, you can change all of those. You can change the sort order here. And then there's also a table below. So the graph visualization is nice, but if you want to see what those actual numbers are, you can do it down below. And you can drill down into things either by clicking on them with this little caret button there or in the visualization itself. Both of them will show the same data. So just very quickly, because I know this seems intuitive to some and just overwhelming for others, I want to go through just a couple of things that you can do here. But I do want to take this opportunity to note that city staff are working on a how to navigate OpenGov story, so that if this seems interesting and you want to drill down into something in particular, we will help you understand what it is you're looking for and how to get to that. So we're working on that. It should be available in the not too distant future, but do know that anything that is shown here, this is not the only opportunity to see it. We will make that available in the future. So as I mentioned on the left side, there are another couple options. So these are available at the bottom. One is views. So these are saved views. So the default view for this one is the general fund revenue and expense type, and then filters. And this is where if there's some particular program, if there's some particular department, if there's some particular something that you're looking for, this is a great way to drill down to find it. So there are a number of options here, whether you show revenues and expenditures, revenues or expenditures alone. And then the filters here are a great way to do that. If you know the fund name, you can search for it. So I could type for general fund and it would give me all of the options that include that. If you click on one, it will filter to that alone. And just display that. There really shouldn't have been a change because it was already filtered to that, but you can do that here. If you don't know what you're looking for, it also has categorizations. So you may or may not know that the general fund is a governmental fund. That's the type of thing that we'll include in the story. And we'll have a listing of all the funds so that it's a little bit easier for you to find what you're looking for. You could also display this in a somewhat different manner. So for instance, one of the typical ways that we look at things is not by expense type necessarily, but by departments. And so this is expenditures and displayed by department. So if you wanted to know what is being planned to spend on library and community services, this is the opportunity to do so. And you can drill down into those and then it will show the finer slices. So while library and community services is a department, it is the umbrella name for a number of different functional areas within the city. So you can view all of those. And so the filters that are in there are funds. So particularly useful if you're looking at all funds versus general fund, departments for functional area, projects typically most useful for capital improvement plan, and then type, so revenue or expenditure. And you can really drill down into these. So if you wanted to just see personnel, you could do salaries and wages or fringe benefits. And then again, that reset button. So if you find yourself down a rabbit hole, you can always reset back to where you were. So I realize that this is a very quick overview of the functionality that's available in OpenGov. And again, we are working on a way to make that much more accessible to the community, but really do want to highlight that we believe this is a way for the budget to be presented in a way that the narrative can be focused on some of the higher level ideas, but it doesn't take away the ability for the community to drill down into some of the very specific items that are included in the budget, which is an extraordinarily difficult line to walk, but we're very excited about the options that are available to the community at this point. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it off to Starla, I believe, who is going to do a wrap up for us.
Thank you, Dan. And just a shout out for all the work that your team has done this past year to bring all that detail online. It's incredibly impressive and important. So just in terms of timeline for the budget, we're going to have a public hearing on the budget to present to the City Council at their June 8th meeting. The community can send written public comments in advance of the meeting or attend meetings and offer verbal public comment as well. Or you can contact your City Council member beforehand and share those thoughts. On June 22nd, we will be presenting the budget for adoption. As Nick Figueras pointed out earlier on, we're obligated to have a new budget in place on July 1. And so this is the opportunity to make progress on, or to adopt the budget. But again, the council will be taking public comment. And then July 1 is our new fiscal year. So looking forward to that and moving forward. So just to wrap up some of the comments or circle back on comments that I think Nick made at the beginning, the City Council considerations at the June 1 and June 22nd meeting, June 8th and June 22nd meeting will be the baseline budget, the service level enhancements, the what will be adopted, and the timing. How and when will those occur? So just to regroup on the resources, there's a printer-friendly document, as Dan has previously pointed out, and there's the OpenGov portal, which is so superior to what we previously had. It's incredibly impressive. And with that, I would just like to also say that both Dan Jacobson and Nick Figueras are available to answer detailed questions if you have those tonight or thereafter. And then just to finalize and wrap up our comments, and then we'll take questions. I do want to say a thank you to the budget team. There's a lot of people here, so I guess I won't go through each and every one of them, but everyone represented here did a tremendous amount of work, and I'm sure their team members also participated and did it and helped out. So thanks to all of the city staff who've worked so hard on this, putting this together, and the technological improvements that Dan and his team and the IT team have managed to implement this year. Incredibly impressive. So Judy, with that, I think we'll turn it over for questions. We have a couple of written questions, I think, and then we'll take verbal questions as well.
Great, thank you so much, Starla. So yeah, just a reminder for folks that are with us now, if you would like to ask a question, you can either raise that hand feature in the bottom of your screen. If you're calling in, you can press *9. That will also raise your virtual hand. And there is a chat feature at the bottom of the screen as well, where you can type in your question. And so I'm going to go to my first hand raised here, and it's Mihal Bortnik. And Nick, if you could unmute, I unfortunately don't see that option. Thank you.
Did I get unmuted?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having this. This is really helpful. I have 3 questions, if that's allowed. If not, then answer however many are allowed. My first question is about overtime. I noticed in the past budget that was actually quite a large line item, particularly for the police department. And it looks like a 0 in the proposed budget. So I'm just curious how that works both in the budget and in reality. Who has the authority to use overtime and why so much of that goes towards the police department? I guess I'll wait for you to answer for the other questions, or should I ask all of them right now?
Yeah, if you, sir, if you wouldn't mind asking all the questions now, we can work on that.
Yeah. So the second one is around policy around hiring from the community. I noticed in the budget that some of the part-time positions, in I think library in particular, got replaced with full-time positions, and there's also a plan to rehire some of the people that were let go. And I'm wondering whether there's any policy around preferring hiring or rehiring from our community. And then the third question was around very noticeable differences in salary levels between different departments. As I would expect, some of that is because the market for different services is different. But I'm also, it's a very stark contrast. I'm wondering what the policies are around, setting those market bands and the seniority levels, which also impact and promotion rules and so on. What we can do to bridge that gap a bit. Those are my questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, so maybe I can field at least the first one because this will be my opportunity to throw out my caveat that we are in the midst of doing this new accounting system. And so there are some glitches. We have noticed a handful of them. It has been brought to my attention that there are balance sheet items in the budget which should not be there. And I think that overtime may be another category of that in terms of what is actually displayed. So we will definitely take that and go take another look at that to make sure that that number is not 0, because it is an anticipated expenditure over the year. And then maybe just speaking to the operational nature of it as to why so much of it ends up in one department versus the other. Typically, the departments that accrue overtime are those ones which have either 24-hour operations, so the police department falls under that category, in which case there are needs to have minimum staffing levels, and that does have an overtime cost associated with it, or those departments which are called back to work. So the nature of their work is such that they can't necessarily fit everything in a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 type job. This would be in many cases things like maintenance, where if there's a water main break in the middle of the night, we will not wait until the next day to go fix that water main, even though there may be some overtime that is associated with that work. So there is some overtime which is critical to the operations of the city, just depending on the functional nature of it. But it should not be 0. However, it should be largely concentrated in those areas where the requirements of the work do include overtime from time to time.
Thank you, Dan. With regard to a policy around hiring members of the community or from the community, we're in a very competitive labor market, and in the past, some of our community members have stepped up to the task and the charge to serve their neighborhood and to serve their peers and community. And we very much appreciate that. As we begin to reopen our services, many of the temporary employees that received a layoff notice last year have been asked if they are interested in returning, and so that applies to the folks who are laid off. In the future, with regard to future recruitments and hiring decisions, we are very pleased when we receive applicants from the community, and look forward to to how they can help provide the services required and address our staffing needs. And then the other question was with regard to noticeable differences between in salary or personnel costs between departments. I don't know specifically which departments you were looking at, but I would like to highlight one fundamental difference between departments, which is in the area of pension costs. The city's pension plans are divided between miscellaneous employees, so that's everyone who is not a sworn officer, and sworn officers, and that is a state regulation, and so the pension costs for a public safety officer is considerably different and higher than a non-public safety personnel. So if you're looking at the police department, that is one explanation. The other areas really depend on the type of personnel that are the level of personnel in the department. So we may have in our engineering department, for example, we are employing engineers, transportation engineers, civil engineers to move our projects forward, and the market does have a higher pay scale for those individuals than perhaps some of the other departments where either the market wages are not as high. So I hope that answered your question. If not, please do feel free to drop me an email, and I'm happy to walk through, or Dan, we're both happy.
I think we might have lost Nick's audio there, but again, please always feel free to reach out to any city staff. We're always here to help and answer what we can. Did have one question come up, and Dan, I guess I can direct this to you. If I don't see something in the budget that I want to see, how do I share my feedback about that?
Sure. So as highlighted during the presentation, there are a number of opportunities for you to share, for members of the community to share with the City Council, given that City Council is ultimately going to be making the decision on what is included in the budget. So I would recommend that any members of the community who do not see something included in the budget that they would like included in the ultimate adopted budget to please reach out to your elected officials, whether individually. Their information is available on the city's website, collectively, whether by email or during public comment during the June 8th public hearing. Or, if you run into them on the street, please do go ahead and let them know that there's something that I would like to see, whether or not it's included in the list of service level enhancements that are in the proposed budget. The City Council still does have authority to include that later on. And then this may be an opportunity to plug that the budget is a living document. So those of you who have been with us over the past year in particular, it gets amended on a regular basis. So even though the budget is adopted prior to July 1st, it is not static and set for the remainder of the fiscal year without changes. There are opportunities periodically throughout the year to change those. So really the main takeaway here, though, is to reach out to your elected officials, make sure that they understand what it is that you're asking for, and just encourage them to include that, to bring that up before the City Council for consideration.
Thanks, Dan. That's good to know that City Council is also another great resource that anyone can tap into. At this time, I see another hand raised. We're looking
So I think we've had
oh,
one in the chat for a little bit, so I do just want to go back to
awesome.
that one. So I think
Perfect.
this one is related to gymnastics probably. So the question is, did the city staff look at participation levels pre-pandemic and deciding what services to bring back first as part of the a la carte planning? How is it decided that gymnastics is not a priority when it is one of the most diverse and inclusive activities, all ages from toddler to adult, all areas of Menlo Park, and classes for individuals with special needs? Seems like it should be a priority, especially at this time when we are trying to bring the community back together after a difficult year. So there is a lot to unpack there. I would say that the major theme here is that there are no non-city council previously approved priorities which are in the proposed budget at this time. City Council directed city staff to provide them a holistic view of what they could consider for incorporation into the budget. And so that is what is prepared in the proposed budget. So that is why the a la carte menu is as prepared. The tiering is merely an organizational tool to help City Council put things into different buckets, given that there are just so many options before them. That is not to say that anything in any of the tiers or in the available service level enhancements is unimportant. They are all options which are available for City Council's consideration. So I do just want to highlight that there currently nothing is included. There was no staff recommendation on what is most important, merely a staff recommendation on what is available. And it will be up to the City Council and their policy direction as to what is ultimately included in this adopted budget once adopted. And then it looks like we have another question in the chat. Is there data showing that gymnastics is a diverse program? I don't know that this one is necessarily a budget-related question. Do we have, though it's possible that we have one of our department heads who is available if that is on hand, though I don't know that that's the case.
Good evening, Sean Reinhardt, Director of Library and Community Services. It's my understanding that based on the feedback we may receive tonight and coming back throughout the rest of the budget process, that the staff proposal is to engage an analysis of the gymnastics program and bring back to City Council options for providing those services in the coming fiscal year. And we certainly would include a look at that data in that process.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, our next question is about itemized development or impact fees. So at the budgetary level, the city does not itemize things typically. So while it theoretically would be possible to itemize, for instance, personnel costs by payroll period, they are not itemized that way. They are really just done at a fiscal year level. So development agreement fee or development fees or impact fees. So development payments would show up in the one-time revenue fund if they're unrestricted. They would show up in the appropriate fund if not. Impact fees will typically be in a special revenue fund. For instance, below market rate housing does have impact fees associated with it. Those amounts will show up as an annualized amount because they are not itemized by a project or development agreement basis. So they are not available at the itemized level within the budget itself.
Thank you, Dan. We have raised hand from Kevin, and Kevin, you should be able to unmute your mic now.
Hi, thanks for holding this session. It's yeah, it's a lot to wrap that around. So it's been very helpful so far. I'm still trying to just make sure I'm really understanding the service level enhancements, particularly in relation to the authorized staffing levels. And I guess I have a couple questions related to that. One would be, so when I'm looking at the staffing levels for 2021 that are included in here, would those be the like before or after the staffing reductions that came about because of COVID? And then I was going to ask about just the kind of the status of these service level enhancements. It sounds like these are all proposals. So these are not things that are currently included in the budget, but the city council can decide on, any or all or none of them as they see fit. So I'm kind of just curious, are these being presented as recommendations, or are they really just being presented as options in a kind of value neutral manner? And then lastly, I'm guessing the answer is no, just because staff capacity, but I'm curious for any or all of these, if there's any opportunity to assess impact of service reductions and I guess whether or not there was impact. I feel like that would be helpful, like information to have in deciding whether or not to return to previous service levels. But yeah, I would definitely understand if that's just kind of beyond capacity. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to take the question?
Sure. So to lead off, the first question that I heard was about staffing levels. The staffing level, particularly if you are looking at the report in there that is authorized staffing level by fiscal year, these are as of budget adoption. So the numbers in there are at the beginning of the fiscal year. So the numbers for fiscal year 2020-21, the fiscal year that we're currently in, are post-reduction. All of the reductions that were incorporated into the last budget process were included in that staffing level. So as of the beginning of the fiscal year, that's why there is such a stark change between 2019-20 and 2020-21, and also why there's not nearly as large a change between 2020-21 and 2021-22. I think I said that right. The only major changes in there are mid-year changes. So there were a number of positions which were reincorporated in the budget by City Council throughout the course of the fiscal year. These are things such as the working on the 2022 housing element, which was a mid-year change, and some staffing level that was authorized in library and community services to work on childcare. And then a small number of positions which were related to City Council adopted priorities. So that would be, for instance, 1/2 of a senior civil engineer to work on the Menlo Park community campus, community center. I lose track of the name from time to time. But so those are as of the beginning of the fiscal year, which would mean that if City Council did incorporate any service level enhancements which had a full-time staffing equivalent associated with them, those would be incorporated into the 2021-22 budget when we got to the adopted budget version. Moving on to the second piece of that, service level enhancement. So everything that is presented as an option for a service level enhancement is, I wouldn't say that value neutral is exactly correct. I think that these are all identified by either conversations with the community, conversations with City Council members, or department heads as a way to increase service to the community in a way that the community would support. So I don't think that there's anything in there that's just you could do it, but nobody knows if it's valuable. I think that everything that's in that list is something that at least some constituent would find valuable. And it really is up to the City Council to determine which ones are most valuable or valuable to the point where they should be incorporated into the budget. So they are certainly options. They are recommendations, but they are recommendations to meet a wide variety of needs. And then the last one, impact of service reductions. I am not personally aware of metrics which would quantify those necessarily. If there are any department heads who have done any analysis on this, I would definitely invite you to come on and share your experiences. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to quantify, which is a negative, and there are so many confounding factors given that most years don't have pandemics. So comparing them to a pandemic year is an inherently very difficult task.
Thank you, Dan. We have another comment in chat, but I would like to connect or unmute Karen Grove's microphone. So Karen, your mic is open. You can unmute it.
Thank you. I had a couple of things that I wanted to ask. I don't know if I'm really asking or advocating, to be honest. I'll turn it into a question. Did staff consider, instead of using the ARP infusion of one-time expenses, I saw that the recommendation was put to City Council, you could use this to accelerate restoration of services before the transient occupancy tax comes back to normal. But you know, the eviction moratorium is going to end at the end of June, and people still have not drawn down the funds from the state and the county to provide rent relief. And sometimes that's because they've tried and their landlord doesn't agree, or it could be because they still don't know about it. It could be a lot of things, but I think that these one-time funds should be, you know, put to the most grave needs, and preventing future homelessness is not just like a humanitarian, absolute urgent call, but it also is a good investment in our future. On a similar vein of homelessness outreach, I noticed in the community development narrative that last year, some of the highlights included a lot of things related to housing, including homelessness outreach. And I know from being on the Housing Commission that the department spent a lot of resources doing that. And I didn't see it highlighted as activities anticipated for the coming fiscal year. So I'm concerned that people will still be homeless, if not more so. Time will be put towards coordinating outreach, but it's not budgeted. So some other more proactive things related to actually creating housing for people and preventing homelessness will not get done. So that is actually a question. Like, is the homelessness task considered complete and it's not going to recur next year and therefore it's not being budgeted for? Or, you know, is that an oversight, or can you explain that to me? So one advocacy point framed as a question, and one actual question. I'm done talking.
Thank you for your question, Karen. Your questions. On the issue of considering the ARP, American Recovery Plan, or federal stimulus monies for purposes other than service or accelerated expansion of service, that is an option that the City Council can consider. Staff did not scope that particular topic. It was not, I don't exactly know how we would scope it, but that is something that the council can give direction at the public hearing on June 8th, so next Tuesday. And then with respect to the homelessness question, I would ask, I see Deputy City Manager Murphy is here.
Yes, thank you. So I'll take a stab at the question. So I think in terms of how it's reflected in the budget document, it was a set of accomplishments. I don't believe that there was necessarily a line item in the budget last year for homeless activities, but that's ultimately what we did spend our time on. So I think for next fiscal year, it does depend. Again, I don't think there's, similarly, there wouldn't be a budget line item called out unless that did become a priority item for the City Council. So there is existing housing staff that has and will continue to spend time on homeless issues. So I think it's depending on the scale of that activity. So I think it would be relatively limited based off the proposed budget.
Thank you, Justin. For the next question in chat, I'll ask our community development or Justin, Justin, you'll take do you see the question?
I
From
think I did a minute ago. So in terms of just refresh my memory in terms of, are we rereading the question or just trying to address, assuming everybody can see? I'm guessing that some people may not, so I'll just try to summarize it a little bit. In terms of, I'll kind of go towards the end. There was a suggestion that we could better educate the public about the request for additional staff in the city's building division. There's a service level enhancement for 3 new full-time equivalents. And with a request to explain how building codes are enforced. So building codes, and it kind of correlates with the 3 positions that are requested. So building codes are enforced multiple ways. So there's federal, state, regional, local requirements imposed on new construction, and the city is responsible to ensure that the new construction complies with those requirements. And so one way of doing that is by showing the proposals on a set of plans. And so those plans need to be plan checked. And so right now the city currently outsources through a contract firm all of our plan checking activity. There's one proposal to bring a new reinstate in-house plan check engineer, with the belief that could we would still retain the outside plan check responsibilities, but that would improve coordination, turnaround time on that plan check activity. Another position is an additional permit tech. So that's a person that many members of the public interact with in terms of applying for, coordinating on the plans, and then revisions that occur later. There's a lot of coordination across divisions, departments, across all the various activities for building code compliance. And then the third position is a building inspector. And so once a permit has been issued based off those approved plans, then construction activity occurs in the field, and the contractor calls for inspections throughout the process, and city staff goes and inspects that work. So given the volume of work that the city is seeing and the desire to increase response times for customers, including a large number of residents that are going through remodels right now due to the pandemic, plus a number of large projects. We've put in a request for 3 full-time staff in the building division. 2 of those were positions that were cut during last year's budget process, and 1 is a net new add. So that kind of summarizes that service level enhancement.
Great, thank you so much, Justin. So it does look like we have no further hands raised, nothing new in the chat, but I do want to give folks just a couple more minutes here and see if anybody is still typing perhaps.
Judy, we do have 1 hand raised.
Yeah, it looks like we did have one. Perfect.
Area, I will allow you to talk. You're now able to unmute your mic.
Hi, this is Adina. Sorry, when there's certain config. This is Adina Levin on. I serve on the Complete Streets Commission, and actually I have some questions that come out of the Complete Streets Commission Transportation Master Plan Subcommittee. And there's some configurations of Zoom that when they lock it down, they also don't allow you to change your name. And so unless I log out of a work software, it shows CMOS Bay Area. I apologize. So the question I have is about the transportation. So I do see that in the staff recommendation about where to on the tier 1 is staffing up for 8 NTMP requests, and that does seem like a higher velocity than historically, and I am wondering whether that leaves enough staffing to continue to fulfill the TMP projects that are in the CIP, you know, or are there any trade-offs that represents between taking the, you know, the responses to people having TMP requests versus, you know, proactively working on the projects that the whole city has put their feedback into and have gotten into the TMP and the CIP. And then another question I had that maybe I'm wondering if staff can provide information on offline is there any geographical distribution of the NTMP requests? Like where are they located? And then the last item is about, you know, is there any way, given the volume of these requests, that there's any way to streamline them? I understand that historically this is designed to be a challenging process, you know, to be able to have traffic calming, which was perceived to be, you know, onerous to residents, but that was, you know, years before we had things like a Vision Zero policy for the city and many more people actually wanting safety. And given that, I am wondering if there's any opportunities to streamline that in terms of being able to have the resources to address proactive projects, in addition to the reactive requests. So that was a whole bunch of questions, and I will stop in this.
Thank you for your question. Do we have Public Works Director or Deputy City Manager?
Yes, I am here. This is Nikki Nagaya, Public Works Director. I'm sorry. Speaking of technological challenges, I don't have video access tonight, but I can speak to this. So thank you, Ms. Levin, for the questions. The Tier 1 service level enhancement that you mentioned, I think includes a restoration of one full-time staff position that was suspended in the budget reductions last year. And so given the number of neighborhood traffic management requests that we have, as you mentioned, there are 8 kind of pending in the pipeline right now, either from kind of prior to the pandemic when they were put on hold, or that have come in since the pandemic began last year. We think that the additional FTE, if it were restored, at least at the beginning, would likely be kind of fully devoted to needing to process those requests. But I think that said, as they begin to work themselves through the process, that would kind of ramp down over time as well. So I think roughly, at least to begin the projects, we think at the beginning of the fiscal year, they would kind of start out kind of fully devoted to that program as it stands today. The second question I think that it was asked was in relationship to opportunities to streamline the existing NTMP program. And I think it is a time-consuming process, both for residents and for staff and commissioners and council members. I think the goal of the program, when it was put in place in the early 2000s, was to really make sure that there was consensus around the improvements before they go to construction, so that there's not things that are built that are then a desire to eliminate. And so I think there are definitely opportunities to re-envision or streamline the procedures in the current program, but I want to make sure that whatever we replace it with still has a public outreach component, and make sure that we can get consensus prior to going to construction, because otherwise what we will expect to see is that things get built and then residents are not happy with the outcome, and that ends up spending more resources of community council and staff time in the long run. So we want to be thoughtful about what we replace the program with if there's a desire to see it modified in some way. And so that in itself would take staff resources, and we want to, if that's something that the council desires to do before we restart the NTMP projects, if the service level enhancement is one that's added, that's something that we could work through and scope out what that process would look like to begin re-envisioning the program before we pick up the specific requests going forward. So I think hopefully got all the questions that were in Ms. Levin's comments, but if there's anything further, feel free to reach out and we can follow up offline as well.
Ms. Levin has raised her hand again, so go ahead and open your mic. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay. Yes, sorry, I was typing with thumbs. So that addresses the questions about the NTMP, but did not yet address the question about whether that request to staff up for those NTMP requests and the volume of those, whether that reflects any trade-offs in terms of being able to deliver the transportation master plan, the TMP projects that are in the capital improvement plan. So there are a number of transportation projects in that CIP that were, also already, went through some pretty substantial community input in terms of selecting those projects. And so the question is there, full capacity to work on those given this other recommendation about where to be putting the staff time? Like, or does this represent any trade-off in terms of putting the resources, in terms of like not having quite enough resources to deliver the projects in the CIP?
Thank you, Ms. Levin. Before Ms. Nagaya responds, I would just like to remind everyone, if you are interested in asking a question, you can raise your hand or type it in the chat, and we intend to wrap up after this next answer. So please do get your questions in. Over to you, Nikki.
Great, thank you, Ms. Levin. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the list of projects in the kind of transportation and streets sections of the capital improvement plan, there's a lot there. There's been a number of transportation projects that have been added to the CIP over the last 3 to 5 years that are awaiting staff resources. So at this point in time, even with the additional FTE that's proposed in the service level enhancement listing in the proposed budget, I don't think that we have the capacity to start all of those projects on July 1st and get them kind of all going simultaneously. That said, I think over the year ahead, we would be able to make progress on a number of the higher priority projects. And we use a listing of criteria that are kind of shown in the proposed budget and CIP in order to prioritize the projects. But one of those prioritization mechanisms is also the City Council top priorities. And there are a number of transportation projects that are listed on the council's kind of top priority list. And this listing was shown on the slides that Dan and Nick walked through earlier tonight, but they involve the Caltrain Rail Corridor Quiet Zone analysis, a number of projects related to climate action, the climate action plan, including the Middle Avenue rail crossing and complete streets project, the Menlo Park Community Campus, and then the 2020 housing element and related zoning code updates. And so all of those projects really touch the staff that would also be working on other CIP projects in the transportation realm. And so what we would expect to do if the budget is adopted and starts July 1st is starting with those high priority projects that the council's identified, work on those first, and then as time allows, we would work through the rest of the CIP listing for the year ahead as time allows. So I think if there's a desire to do more, then those top priority projects kind of very early on in the year, then that we would need to revisit our resources and capacity to be able to deliver more than that. But I think the other piece of the equation is our ability to onboard and bring on a number of staff kind of immediately. And so I think it's kind of weighing the pros and cons of adding that capacity versus the capacity of hosting community meetings and working through the number of projects they have in mind to move forward for next year, and also to move them through the council approval process in a set period of time. So we're trying to balance what we think is possible, not only with staffing resources, but community resources, council agenda time, and meeting fatigue going forward into the year ahead as well. And then I think there's one other component of the question that it asked about the location of the 8 projects in the neighborhood traffic management program pipeline. And so we can follow up specifically on the listing of locations. I don't have that in front of me tonight, but they're generally spread in different areas around the city, but we'd want to confirm the specific locations so we can give a more complete answer to that.
Thank you, Ms. Nagaya. Karen Grove, you have your hand raised, and you can now unmute your mic.
Thank you. I am now asking about things I know very little about, but the Neighborhood Transportation Management Program, knowing very little about it, I'm wondering why it made the cut for staff to suggest restaffing it, at first, before some of the TMP projects are fully staffed, et cetera. Partly, I'm asking because it feels like a very unequitable way of making change in the city, in that a resident has to file a complaint and then staff has to get involved and do community outreach. People have to participate in the community outreach. And then, as I understand it, 2/3 of the neighbors need to approve the project before it goes forward. So that just seems like a case study in designing things for people in the city who are accustomed to having their voice heard and listened to take action, because they have a lot of optimism that if they take action, they'll get a good result. Whereas people who've been historically marginalized have no reason to believe that if they go through all of this effort, that they'll get a positive result based on history. And they are more likely to be lower income, barely making ends meet, and not have so much discretionary time to put into such a process. So given that we're trying to, I know it's not on the exact priority list, but it's like the top of the next list to embark on the racial equity I forget what all the acronym stands for, but to make our operations more racially equitable. I don't know, was that considered? And even independent of the equity aspect, I'm wondering, where does the demand come from? So 2 questions, where's the demand from? And second question, given the equity impact, would you change your recommendation? Having heard what I said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Grove. So I think, again, I'm sorry, I don't have the list of the 8 project locations in front of me tonight, but what I can say is that for those residents who have been on kind of the waiting list for these projects, you know, some of them started their requests to the city kind of as far back as 2018, 2019 timeframe. And so when the program was suspended in light of the reduction in 3 staff members in the transportation division last year, there have been a number of individuals and residents in those affected neighborhoods who've been waiting for a significant period of time. And so even though the program's suspended, we do spend a reasonable amount of staff time continuing to correspond with those residents about the program, and others who inquire about, you know, how to make a request for a traffic calming device in their neighborhood. So that said, I do acknowledge that the program is intensive, and it is, you know, defines a very significant bar to clear. It requires 50% of residents in the kind of affected area, kind of the study area for traffic calming device proposals to affirmatively choose to move forward with construction of those projects. So it is something that's very staff intensive, that's very intensive for the involvement of community members. And I think it's part of the reason why we've traditionally not fielded an equal number of requests across the city in different geographic areas. We do have separately a proposal, an evaluation underway right now for the Bellhaven neighborhood specifically. And so that is a traffic calming plan. Temporary improvements are on the ground now, and we're moving into currently the next steps of final surveys before we determine whether or not to keep those improvements in place longer term. And so we wouldn't necessarily expect that there is a huge pent up demand in District 1 right now because that traffic calming plan was neighborhood wide, and it is more focused on identifying corridors and improvements for traffic calming around the whole neighborhood. So I think I'm happy to explore ways that we can, you know, modify the neighborhood traffic management program in light of both the demands on community members' time and in relationship to a racial equity lens. I think in order to do that, it still takes some time to re-envision what the program should be and where the priorities should land. And if that's the best direction in order to take those steps first, I think that's a fair use of those additional resources. But what's proposed is still a net request for additional resources. And so to do any of that work, I think the first step is getting the resources in place as part of the budget process. But we're happy to adapt the proposal to kind of meet the evolving needs of the community and in light of the rest of the conversations happening.
Thank you, Ms. Nagaya. And we have an additional hand raised from Ms. Baruzzi, and you should be able to unmute your mic now.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much. Not to belabor the NTMP, but there was one extra little factor that I wanted to raise, which is given limited resources, I would love the city at some point to do, I don't know, maybe a safety audit, because I think people have sort of highly individualistic experiences of what feels unsafe, and can sort of, you know, rally people to their cause. And if we had unlimited time and resources, we could just make every street safer. And I think we should. But I continue to look at that Thames map with the extra large circles along key arterial roads and sort of and look at the accident rates outside of neighborhoods on main sections of in our city, and worry that as helpful as it feels to prioritize neighborhood requests, that we might be spending overspending resources in areas where there's not quite as much need. And so I know that there's part of the NTMP that has to do with warranting, but I'm curious for Ms. Nagaya and for others, as you're thinking about scarce resources, how do you think about the needs analysis for the whole city and the opportunity cost of focusing on, speed bumps on a street with really low traffic at the expense of maybe like fixing pretty bad intersections in Willow Road? That's my question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ms. Peruzzi. Yeah, no, I think that is a tough question. Balancing the needs between what we hear from individual residents, individual constituents, and being responsive to those against the needs of the whole city is something I think we struggle with on a regular basis, because there are limitations on time and financial resources to build projects at the end of the day. So that said, I think the transportation staff that we have currently at the city are guided by the existing policy documents that we have in terms of prioritizing time, and the way that we look at prioritizing projects is set forward in the implementation kind of chapter of the transportation master plan. And so that was really meant to weigh a variety of different factors around safety and mobility choices, and the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There were 8 to 10 different criteria that we were using to rank and prioritize projects that were identified in the transportation master plan. But the transportation master plan did not audit and review kind of neighborhood level, neighborhood street level traffic calming issues. That's kind of a much more focused effort, and we were kind of from the outset of development of the transportation master plan, that was kind of above and beyond the scope of what you can really do in a citywide kind of master planning document. So we never really envisioned rating and ranking neighborhood requests against the kind of larger capital projects of corridors or intersections around the city. Because my kind of expectation is that we have to balance and do some of both on a regular basis in order to make to be responsive to what we hear from the community. But if that's not the case, I think the council does have the ability to direct the resources in a way that I think is most fitting to what we want to accomplish in the year ahead. This is, I think, partially a budget discussion in the relationship to the resources that we have available, that kind of the whole pie of resources to say. But it's also more of a policy level discussion around, within the resources that we have available, how do we want to spend that time? And it sounds like the feedback we're hearing tonight is maybe the conversation that needs to happen is that second part around the policy for how to prioritize the time. So I think that's probably as deep as I can go in the context of the budget tonight.
Thank you, Nikki or Ms. Nagaya. I'm not seeing any more questions or hands raised, so I will hand it off to you, Starla, for final comments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Figueres. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of your questions and your interest in both the policy questions and the budget issues, and really just how well you've read our budget. And just a special thanks to Dan Jacobson and Nick Pigueras, who worked tirelessly on putting this document together. And I encourage and invite all of you to attend the June 8th council meeting, public hearing, where we will consider this in depth. So thank you all for joining tonight. I really appreciate it.